Hello, everyone. Today is Monday, September 14th. As always, I'm your host for Collectibles and Coffee, Edward Nguyen. Today, we'll be following up a little bit about our interview with Charlie Hurlocker from last Friday. You can catch that interview if you want. It's available on our YouTube channel, Vermilion PDX. I would strongly recommend that anyone who is interested in grading cards at all listen to that interview. It's very informative. It has a lot of information. There's a lot of historical context and background, as well as information for people who may be new to the grading game and wanting to get their cards or comics or anything graded. So that being said, let's dive right in. There's a lot to cover today. My beverage of choice today is cold brew, low almond milk, low creamer. It's my go-to beverage. So topic at hand, graded cards. So we talked about grading. Charlie kind of gave a bit of an overview for what they are, what the history of it is, what grading cards, what grading just memorabilia in general stems from. And we had discussed that a lot of where these companies start are media companies. In the case of PSA, professional sports authenticators. A lot of these companies got their background from grading sports cards, which is really where the market originated. That was what most of the popularity has stemmed from. So grading TCGs, grading these other things, these are largely newer entries to the market. This is something that came much later. And that was out of necessity of these companies having demand from people who were wanting to get their TCG cards graded, their Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, various things. And these companies had realized that there's no reason that these services shouldn't be offered for these collectors. Part of the difficulty is developing a comprehensive catalog. There are so many different items in TCGs. We look at the sheer volume, even for Magic, which is relatively new. Magic has only been around for 27 years, which in the context of sports cards is a pretty small period of time, considering how you have baseball cards that are well over 100 years old at this point, and some of those are among the rares and do get some of the highest prices on the market due to their scarcity, due to their age. Receiving and being able to catalog all these is, I imagine, a huge barrier for a lot of these companies. I think a lot of them are slow to get in, but a lot of them have been working very hard to be able to develop that comprehensive catalog, to be able to manage a large database that does manage population reports or set registries in the case of PSA, where people collect sets trying to get the best quality cards for their sets that they can. And that is really the backbone of grading. Grading is so prevalent, again, in the sports card industry because a lot of these things, unlike traditional TCGs, unlike Magic or Pokemon, where cards have utility, where cards are tied, or where prices are tied to how powerful something is, sports cards are purely aesthetic. They're collectible. A lot of sports cards companies have made their name based on creating very, very short print runs on certain cards. Some cards, there's a very known number of how many pieces they have, and their scarcity is entirely tied to the value of the card. A lot of it's speculation. A lot of people try and buy rookies for cards for people that they think will be hot later on. We can see like rookies for a lot of stars today. Tom Brady, LeBron James, Mike Trout. Their early era cards are among some of the most valuable cards out there in the modern era because getting a rookie card, by the time these stars have really begun to make a name for themselves, their cards would already be expensive. So anyone who bought in early is really able to capitalize on that success. And grading just adds a level of attractiveness, a level of elegance to cards. Again, because sports cards are usually meant for display, for as a novelty piece, as a desk trophy, various things that you see people put out for sports cards, for high-end sports cards, for high-end collectibles, encasing them inside a hard acrylic case, protects them from damage. It makes them very valuable, makes them very aesthetically pleasing as a way to showcase your cards, to showcase your hobby. And by expanding that range, a lot of these companies have really been able to grow the hobby industry by being able to showcase higher end collectibles. And as a result, a lot of these companies, they do offer grading services for almost anything at this point. Baseballs, basketballs, footballs, right? These are fairly common things. You see that people have graded. Grading video games is becoming more and more common. A lot of video games we had growing up as kids from my generation, right, from vintage SNES games, even like PlayStation games, right, the original Final Fantasies in their original box sealed are fairly valuable, and people do like to get them graded. The original Pokemon games, finding them sealed is quite difficult. Finding them in nice condition and sealed is even harder, so there's a large premium for finding those graded games. And again, this simply stems from the idea that these are visually attractive and they make great display pieces for when people want to showcase them. So today, with this kind of information in mind, I'm going to kind of go through some of the bigger grading services. A lot of this is a recap from what Charlie and I had discussed when I did the interview with him. But again, this is just kind of to provide some broad context for people who may not be as familiar to grading cards. That's primarily what I'm going to focus on. I realize that there are people out there who would be looking to get video games graded, to be looking at getting various sports memorabilia graded. That's kind of a different conversation. The idea is the same, but that's a market that I'm not as familiar with. I'm more intimately familiar with grading cards and just trading cards in general. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. So we'll start off with PSA. PSA is really kind of the first, as it were, to the TCG market, to the sports card market. That's something that they've done for a very long time. They're very well known. They do really try and grade anything and everything, which is why we see them very popular among Pokemon cards. Some of the most valuable cards that have ever been sold have been graded by PSA. They do have a certain level of history to them that kind of transcends some of these other grading companies. Really, by being the first and being able to offer so many different services has really done very well for them. That's why they're as big and successful as they are. Just some of the examples of cards that have been sold that have been graded by PSA. The T206 Honest Wagner card, right? That's really kind of the holy grail of baseball card collecting. There's probably like a 2-digit number of those in the world. Some of them are very well tracked. You have the famous Wayne Gretzky card, the one that he owned, his version of it that was graded. It's been sold several times at auction over the years. It has a pretty interesting history to itself. That is really one of like the driving forces. That's why collecting is such a great hobby. I think that's why a lot of people like it, because there's a lot of background, there's a lot of provenance to some of these more exquisite cards. And I believe the record-setting sale for that was in 2016. I think it sold for like $3 million or something at auction. That really goes to show how big of a hobby sports cards can be, and PSA, by being the first, by being there for the longest, and being able to grade everything, has really pushed kind of what it means to be a collector for grading PSA cards. I do have one in front of me here. I'll bring this up to video to make it so people can see it. Because they have graded Pokemon cards for a long time, PSA is kind of the benchmark that Pokemon collectors go to. That's what they look at in terms of graded cards. They all do have a unique serial number on them. That way you're able to look it up on the website. You can see when it was graded. Make sure the card itself is authentic. That's a big part of it. If you look on the back, there is a QR code that allows you to scan it and you can immediately reference the card. There are security features inside the label that prevent counterfeiting and tampering. That's a big part of this. And again, Pokemon cards, they do well with PSA. People seem to like it. It's something that they've done for quite some time. The biggest thing, I do have some gripes about PSA. These are my personal opinions. They do shift a little bit around inside the case. If I shake it here, you can kind of hear the card shaking around inside the case. It's not entirely sealed inside the case, which I don't really care for. I do wish that they were secured a little bit better. The label is relatively simple. It's pretty straightforward. There are no subgrades on it, unlike CGC and BGS. They do offer subgrades. In addition, they don't also offer high level of granularity. They don't have 0.5 grades, which in my mind kind of hurts. It is a double-edged sword. It does make PSA 10s much more valuable than PSA 9s because there's that gap. Trying to close that gap and getting the 10 is a huge leap over a 9. Granted, this is fairly common across the board. A small difference in grading does usually command a large premium in price, especially when you talk about higher end things, especially things that are very, very hard to find in nice condition. So I do think that not having subgrades, not being able to see where your flaw in the card is a little rough. That being said, grading is largely subjective. It's hard to say how grading goes. One of the more popular things is for cards that are PSA 9, you'll frequently see people crack them. That means they open them out of the case, and they'll actually resubmit them for grading, hoping that they'll get a more lenient grader that might push it into a 10. Depending on the value of the card, it may be worth the gamble. Obviously, sometimes you can get a more stringent grader, and then your 9 will become an 8, which is a little rough. Likely that means that you'll just be cracking it and sending it again for submission. Depending on the value of the card, that may or may not be worth it. For a card that's obviously more valuable towards the higher end, when you're talking about a different one up in grade, can mean hundreds or thousands of dollars. Submitting it again is probably well worth it. That being said, these the cases are very durable. They're pretty, they do look nice. There's a certain level of simplicity in the red and white that I like. And the PSA website is relatively easy to navigate. It's for grading cards, for anyone who wants to grade themselves. Last episode with Charlie, I did explain the use of having a middleman to grade cards. Charlie is one of them. The contact information is available for anyone who wants to reach out to him to get their cards graded via PSA or CGC. The biggest thing, and this was one of the things that we mentioned with Charlie, is all these grading companies. They do have a subscription-based service. You pay for a membership, and it entitles you to be grading a certain number of cards on a regular basis. You get X number of cards every so often. Higher levels of subscriptions will allow for more submissions to be sent in. So this is a little bit more difficult, something that is hard to stomach as a TCG collector. The subscription-based model stems from sports cards, when you have set releases that are much more frequent, as opposed to our traditional TCGs like Magic, like Pokemon, where you see quarterly set releases. Sets are released every 3 to 4 months, whereas sports cards are much more common. One, because there's more sports, and two, the nature of the industry just pushes them to be printing sets more often, more frequently. So with PSA, one of the things that if you do want to submit cards yourself, you do have to remember that you will pay premium for submitting more valuable cards, and part of that is so that whenever your cards are sent back to you, they're able to properly insure the card. I understand why they do it. In my mind, I think it's kind of a silly reason. You should bake that into your price. If you look at the pricing for grading cards, there's actually an increasing price for grading cards the higher and higher they get. The higher the card value of the card, the more of a premium they'll want. Again, this is entirely tied into insurance. when they send it back to you, especially on more valuable cards. You want to know that it's insured and done properly. That being said, a lot of these companies, Beckett, PSA, CGC, they do offer in-person services. That's not the case anymore, obviously, but at large sports conventions, they'll actually have a booth set up where you can pay for a one-day turnaround. You drop off your card with a submission form, and then they'll grade it right on the spot. They'll enclose it, they'll slab it right away, and then you can pick it up at the end of the weekend. That's a service they have provided. That's, again, one of the things I imagine people who do have higher end cards would be more keen on doing. If you're looking to send in a stack of cards to get graded, you'll be sending at a bulk level, which means you'll probably be waiting a long time. You do pay per price. The more cards you send in one go, the more likely, the bigger of a discount you'll get. Again, pushing for bulk pricing implies a larger submission at one time. That's kind of the reality of it. So for PSA, that's kind of their standard, relatively straightforward. In the sports market, you do have a lot of dealers that will submit entire print runs of cards. They'll just open up tons and tons of product and they'll just submit everything. We're talking like 100,000 plus submissions for these cards. Very, very, very large. As of right now, PSA is fairly backed up. If you are just looking for your cheapest bulk level grading, you can expect to wait for a very long time. The reality situation is that if you do submit cards via bulk to PSA, you may as well forget them, again, because of how heavily they are backlogged in their cards, how long it takes for them to receive it, to be able to match it to the submission form, and then grade it, slab it, send it back out. You're looking at a pretty long time. It's something you have to learn to be patient about. It's not something that's done quickly. That's the unfortunate reality of the situation. The pandemic has really pushed a lot of people to go back, look for their old collectibles, look for older items that they have that they're looking to get graded. One, because in theory, with a nice enough condition, if you had the foresight to take care of your cards as a kid growing up, and now you're sending them to get graded, you should expect a large market premium. There's a trade-off. It is a fairly difficult process if you're not in the know-how, if you don't know how to do it properly. It is kind of a pain to be able to properly catalog and have all the descriptions for your cards. Again, this is why I personally use a middleman. I use Charlie. I've said before, this isn't strictly an advertisement for him. This just is more, this is a nod to the fact of how difficult it is to get things graded and why using a middleman is preferable, especially I value my time. It's not, again, because of how difficult it is, I'd rather have someone else do the legwork and make sure it's done right rather than having any hiccups that would occur at the grading service itself. So for PSA, that's really all my thoughts on it. Again, for Pokemon, still kind of the go-to. The fact that there are more competitors in the market, the fact that people are starting to use CGC, the fact that CGC does want entry into the TCG market is, I think, great overall. Giving people choices is always a good thing. I suspect that PSA will be the forerunner in Magic for quite some time, just because being the first usually gives you a huge advantage over anyone else that wants to come in. You have to be able to persuade people that what you're offering is going to be better or at least different enough that it's worth going for. But overall, PSA, very, very nice, very simple. Anyone who does want to grade, perfectly acceptable place to start. Moving on, we'll talk about BGS. BGS Beckett Grading Services is a media company. They're a little bit newer. I think they were established in the late 80s. The owner of Beckett, named Beckett himself actually, he was a statistician early on in his career before he started the company. He was probably one of the early people to really push sports cards, to develop a market for sports cards. And what they've done is Beckett Media Services, they've actually had publications where they would discuss the value of trading cards, of sports cards, and that really kind of gave people in the early days a foundation for grading cards and for pricing cards in general. So this is an example of a graded Beckett card that I have here. This is a Beta Zombie Master 9.5. One of the biggest changes over PSA that I do like about Beckett, I do like this about CGC as well, I don't unfortunately have a CGC card to show, is you can see the subgrades here below. The subgrades give you a pretty good idea of how the card fares. You can see where the flaws in the card are. You can see what can be done. And it gives you a better idea that if you did want to try and regrade it, you can look and critique the particular area that the card fell short on and critically think, is this really worth regrading because I know what's wrong with it? Do I think that this was a fairly stringent grader that gave me a lower grade? And would it be something that I could reasonably have it bumped? So in the case of this card, this is a 9.5. There's 9.5 on centering, corners, edges, and a 9 on surface. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory. Centering is to have a well-centered card. There's obviously miscuts. That does detract away from the centering. Ideally, again, just for the sake of visual appeal, a card should be centered up vertically and horizontally. Centering is one of those things that's very, very difficult to get right on early cards for Magic. Alpha beta cards notoriously off-center, mainly because the printing quality back then, the Q&A wasn't quite as good. It was nowhere up to today's standards. So even pack fresh, you open up a card, it can be perfectly clean around the edges. It can be pristine card, but if it's off-center, you're not going to get a good grade. That's the unfortunate reality of it, but centering is one of those things that you can't really control. You just have to hope that the card that you own, especially if you're looking to open them, does look nice and centered when you're opening it. Because most of the other things can be largely controlled if you open up a pack and you open it up carefully. In theory, you should have a relatively clean card. Surfaces, one of those things, also notwithstanding, you can get scratches. That's unfortunate. That's usually what is the biggest detraction. That usually is where you lose the most points on surface. For corners, you're looking at the condition of the corners. Are they nice and rounded? There should be no damage to the corners. If you look at collector's edition cards and international edition cards, because they have square corners, getting them graded, the biggest problem you see is the corner grade. Because they're nice and sharp and square, they're very, very easy to get damage, even straight out of the packaging. The tight shrink wrap, even it can get banged around inside the box, and then you get some damage in the corners, and you lose on the corner grade. The edges, just edges. Is there whitening along the edges? Whitening usually refers to fingernail marks from people picking up the card. That's the white that you see around the edges. That's the edge grade. And then surface, are there scratches on the surface of the card? Usually much more common and usually much more visible in foils. But again, surfaces, the surface grading, you should be able to see if there are scratches on it. I've looked at this before. I thought this is one of the things I thought about resubmitting. The reality is it's not worth resubmitting. I'm not going to get better than 9 on the surface. There are some visible surface scratches if you look closely at the card. So this is just the reality on this card. It's fine. It's a 9.5. I've accepted that. One of the cool things to note about the grade for BGS is this label. One, it is elegant. I do like the look on it, but the coolest thing that they do is this label. They actually change the color label to help indicate the grade. So anything below a 9, a 9.0 or lower, will just have a regular silver label. So it will still say everything. It'll also have the set name, year, your subgrades, your serial number, your final grade. It'll still have all that, but the label will be silver. At 9.5 and 10, you'll have a gold label, which you can see here. The label is gold. And then the holy grail of BGS is getting a pristine black label. If you have a 10 card and all 4 subgrades are 10, you'll get a black label. It is very, very nice. It is very sharp. The entire label is black and it says pristine on it. those are some of the probably the rarest cards you can find. There is a huge premium for black labels, simply because of how rare they are. Again, because grading is so subjective, you can submit hundreds of cards that were pack fresh, just straight from the pack into a sleeve and then sent off for grading, and it is very likely that you will not get a black label. It's something that they don't hand out often. There is a huge premium for them. Most notably, grading Ultimate Masters box toppers has been a fairly common trend. You can see that there is a very large price increase on the black label box toppers. Again, simply the virtue of how hard it is to get a 10 on one grade, and then you have to get a 10 on all 4 grades. If I were to look at this card, if I didn't have this... Oh, wow, that's not great for the slab. If I were to look at this, if this card wasn't great, I would look at it, I would legitimately say this is a near mint card. This is a very nice near mint card. The fact that it's graded and it's not even a 10 really goes to show how hard it is to get a 10 overall. So one of the services that Beckett actually does offer is that similar to PSA, you can actually get an option where there's no subgrades on your card. It will be a final grade only. It does come a little bit cheaper, mainly because there's less data entry, there's less points they have to look at. They can just look at the card overall and assign one grade there without having to go through all these finer points. So when it comes to Beckett, in terms of submission, one of the things I do like is that they actually offer a flat fee. To my understanding, the only difference in price is how quickly of a turnaround you want your cards to come back. Obviously, the more patient you're willing to be, the cheaper you can have your card graded for. Otherwise, it's a very similar pricing model to PSA. Submitting in bulk will get you a larger price discount. Not having subgrades, also price discount from there. I believe it can go as low as $15 for a card to be graded like this with subgrades. Can get down to $15 with enough cards being submitted. I do like BGS a little bit more for Magic cards. I do think that Pokemon is also starting to catch on, mainly because the black label is very attractive, and because of how difficult it is to get a black label, it really does command a massive premium. That's why for modern era cards in Pokemon, you do see more and more people trying to submit to BGS to try and get a black label. It is kind of different. Again, more companies out there. I think there is having more competition is healthy, giving people more choices. Again, because at the end of the day, a lot of people that do collect, that do want to own these graded cards, they're really looking for a premium in terms of how nice something is, because Pokemon is such a visual hobby, because a lot of people are concerned about aesthetics. People do want to see that grading cards that the graded card itself, the label looks aesthetically pleasing. They're nice. When people display them, they're visually cool to look at. I think BGS does capture this very well. And BGS has done very well for itself. Again, because it's primarily the choice that people who grade Magic cards use. There will always be a certain benchmark that people expect. For an Alpha Black Lotus, right? There were 2 record sales in the past year. In 2018, there was an Alpha Lotus that sold. I don't have the price in front of me. I was actually trying to find the exact auction. But in 2019, right, we had the historic Alpha Black Lotus that sold for $166,000 on PWCC. The Black Lotus is really Magic's marquee card. That is kind of the face of Magic. Everyone knows what a Black Lotus is, and BGS is the one. They were the ones that graded it, so that was a big deal for them. BGS actually put it in their newsletter, and they did make a note about how it was a historic sale and how big that was. One of the things to note about Alpha cards, and similarly in the vein of the Alpha Lotus, is it's very hard. It's unlikely that there will ever be Black Label Black Lotus. If there ever was one to be graded, that card would probably be worth over $1 million. Again, the print run for alpha, beta, unlimited cards in the early days, because the printing quality wasn't up to par with what it is today, there are a lot of things that will just never be... there are some cards that will never be a 10. There are some cards it will be very difficult to get 9.5. Print dots actually count against a card's grading. Print dots, roller lines, right? That kind of indent that you see going either vertically or horizontally across the card. These are all relics from Magic's previous printing process. Again, they do count again against the grade itself. It's kind of unfortunate. In the case of comics, these defects actually don't count against the grade. If they were a manufacturer defect, like missing a staple, right, that would be considered to be a misprint in the context of Magic. But missing a staple, there's assuming that there are no staple holes, right? Assuming that the staple was never properly put into the comic, it doesn't actually count against the grade of the comic itself. Whereas, again, alpha, beta, there's various print dots, roller lines, a lot of just factory defects that some of them are prevalent on every single card. Alpha Mox Sapphire has a print dot on it. It's on every Alpha Mox Sapphire. You will never have a BGS 10 Alpha Mox Sapphire as a result. BGS Magic, pretty big deal. We've seen this a lot. I do like the look on the BGS cards. Again, they each have their pros, they each have their cons. I do like that you probably can't see it on the camera here. I'll try and bring it as close as possible, but you can actually see that there's an inner sleeve inside around the card that even when you shake the card, I put the card up to the mic and shook it around. The card doesn't actually move because it's inside the sleeve, inside the case itself, and that gives a better level of protection. Again, not a big fan of the fact PSA card, if I shake it, right, you can hear that's the sound of the card rattling around inside. It's a little rough. It makes it harder to be able to open up the card and then submit it again for grading, because right, by doing this, I'm probably going to be damaging the card in some form or another. Luckily, this is a 10. I don't need to resubmit it. So, but again, having this inner sleeve, it does add another level of protection. I do like the fact that the label is color-coded. The black label is something that people do aspire for when submitting cards for grading, and I think just that level of aesthetic is very, very nice on Beckett. That's something that I do like what they do over PSA. So moving on, the last one we'll talk about is CGC, Certified Guarantee Company. They are newer to TCGs. I actually only heard about them recently, mainly because I'm not as familiar with grading comics, which is really where they got, which is where they built their name. They do grade various other things, right? They're originally known as being a numismatic grading company, grading coins, stamps, paper money, currency, etc. That was one of their big divisions. They got their start grading comics originally. And some of the most notable auctions for comics have been CGC graded ones, trying to find nice premiums. That's something that they've done a very long time. They have a very elaborate setup for grading comics. Grading a card, pretty simple. You're looking at card front and back. When you're grading a comic, you have to go through page by page. You have to look at everything, making sure that, right, the artwork is in nice condition. You're looking at the edges of the comic itself, the paper quality, making sure there's no water damage, ink blots, right, these various things. There's a lot more, it's a much more involved process for grading comics versus grading cards. So trying to find nice graded comics is fairly difficult. There is a higher level of granularity for grading comics. You actually have a 10, 9.8, 9.6, 9.4, 9.2, 9.0. I don't believe it goes all the way down, but because there are very relatively small things that can affect the grading quality of a comic, these very, very small, fine subgrades on them is a much bigger deal for collectors, and that's something that is much more appealing to them. So two of the most notable comics, Action Comics #1, right? This is, again, kind of the holy grail of comic book collecting. People who collect comic books, this is something that they've reprinted. This is something they've done, but the original cover, the original copy, when it came out in 2014, Action Comics #1, 9.0, graded by CGC, sold for $3.2 million. That's the highest price, to my understanding, that's ever been a comic book has ever sold for. And as a point of reference, an 8.5 Action Comics #1 had only sold for 1.5 million. And that really goes to show how difficult it is to get a small bump in quality, and how much of a price difference it can make, right? A 0.5 price difference there is worth $1.7 million. Right? We're talking about probably difference between a 9.0 and an 8.5. We're probably looking at very, very small trace differences that would not be readily visible, would not be readily apparent to most people. Only CGC, looking at it, going through the entire comic with a fine-tooth comb, would be able to really discern this, be able to differentiate this, and then as a result, create that huge, huge price jump for the comic, right? Like in comics, right? I believe Action Comics, I'm going to pull it up here so I don't get it wrong. This card, the original cover was dated in 1938, right? At this point, we're looking at a comic book that's math is hard here. Right, 82 years old, right? This is a piece of paper, or pieces of paper rather, 92 years old, right? That's 3 times older than an Alpha Black Lotus for any Alpha card. And trying to find these things that have existed for this long in pristine condition is exceedingly difficult. And this really goes to show why grading puts such a premium on cards, on comics, on collectibles, because the people who can afford it, who have the money to spend, who are truly nostalgic about these things, that are wanting to collect these various pieces of their hobby, of their childhood, are willing to put out the big bucks for trying to find something that that does have that condition premium. Because Action Comics, right, it has been reprinted before. It does have a similar cover. They have new issues that have come out, and they're a fraction of the price. So those, if people want to read the comic, if people want to enjoy the comic, it's still there. But again, getting that truly original 1938 copy, huge, huge, huge premium among collectors. Really the holy grail of comic book collecting. So that's CGC. That's kind of a legacy they've built. Comic books are kind of a different animal, as we mentioned before. Restoration is something that is kind of a big deal in comics. A lot of these comics, because they're so old, because they have existed for as long as they have, it's really, really hard to find something in nice condition, right? If we're talking about comics from this era, right, the 30s, 40s, 50s, right, you're talking about a piece of paper that's had to survive 60, 70 years at this point. Most of them didn't have the same value back then that they did today, right? A lot of this has picked up in recent history. It's likely that someone in possession of one of these, right? If it was in a stack of comics that's inside someone's attic, probably not in the best condition. So finding something that is clean, in nice condition, really, really demands a premium. And CGC has really been at the forerunner of that. And more recently, as we discussed in our interview with Charlie, they're really wanting to make the push into TCG market. That's something that they can capture. They've already done it all, as it were. Again, people collect coins, people collect money. That's something that they grade. They have various divisions of their company that are responsible for grading coins, paper money, currency, stamps, etc. But TCG is kind of the last frontier, as it were, in terms of people who want to, of collectors who are wanting to submit things for grading. And CGC's entry to the market, I think, is, again, very, very cool. the fact that there's another newcomer, someone else that is in the market that is able to grade cards, gives people a different option. I think that's healthy for the industry overall. You always want to see competitors. No one wants to see a monopoly on something. That's worse for the market. That's worse for people who want to enter. That's worse for the consumer. And having all three options is healthy. For CGC, again, if you look at their website, it's a very nice website. You can actually look at the process they have that goes into grading comics, grading cards. It's very elaborate. I don't unfortunately have a CGC card in front of me. I actually have to send a submission off to CGC. I do want to get a handful of cards. That'll likely be a future unboxing video that I want to do, just to be able to showcase what CGC cards look like, kind of how stringent they are, how fair they are on grading. That's actually one of the biggest critiques of BGS overall, is that the serial number on here, based on the serial number, you know what era a card was graded. And there are certain eras, there are certain serial number batches that are known to be much more strict, much more stringent than others. So people know that cards from that era should likely be resubmitted for regrading. In certain eras, they're much more lenient. So you have some cards where you may have to look at the card more carefully. There's always talk about you want to buy the card, not the grade. This is one of the hotly contested debates in grading cards. It's very well possible this may not be a 9.5. This could be a 10. This could be a 9. It really goes both ways. So there are people that look at the card itself, and there are certain cards. There will always be a discussion, subjective, right? Whether a card deserves its grade. And a lot of people do actually buy slab cards, look at the serial number, look at the card itself, and evaluate, is this worth cracking and resubmitting? Especially, this is not the best example. I think this card is only a couple $100, not really worth going through the effort, right? But there are, again, in the case of older cards, more valuable cards, when you're talking about 0.5 grade that could potentially increase its value by $1,000, it's probably worth considering and going through. So with CGC, new entry, I want to see what they look like. I don't have any experience with them. I've only seen CGC cards on auction or via remote media. I've seen pictures of them. I actually haven't held one myself, so I don't know what they look like. I know that just from what I've seen, their cases are very attractive. They do have a very nice aesthetic to them. I think, again, at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to when you're looking for graded cards. Aesthetics is everything. You want it to be clean. You want it to be nice as a display product or something. In the interest of, for people that do want to hold on to it, the fact that CGC does offer a pedigree service, you can actually have your name printed onto the label in the back. That's something that's very cool that CGC does. Again, this kind of harkens back to the day of comic book collecting. A lot of people who want to own something, they don't care about getting rid of it. They're buying it, not necessarily just for investment purposes, but because it is something that's near and dear to their heart. The collector in their heart would put their name on the back and have it known that it is their piece. It creates a nice bit of provenance to the piece itself. Right, the example we used at the beginning of the episode, the T206 Honest Wagner card, the copy that's owned by Wayne Gretzky, it's so well documented where it is. In theory, we know exactly which copy he owned. That provides a nice bit of history through the card itself. And I think that CGC is very, very smart to offer that pedigree service for their card. Similar to PSA, when you grade with CGC, you will be paying a premium based on the value of the card. The more valuable something is, you'll be paying for the insurance. You do pay a premium on the card. There's different brackets depending on how valuable something is that you will pay a premium for. So that's CGC kind of in a nutshell. They do each have their own their pros and cons. I'm a little bit torn. Obviously, most people, they don't have a infinite amount of cards to send, right? I do have a liberty of doing so I will actually be, of all the cards I do plan on sending in for grading, I'll probably separate it. I'll probably have a batch that goes to PSA and CGC. I'll be doing that with Charlie. For BGS, I'm a little bit more hesitant to use BGS right now. BGS actually does have an even bigger backlog than PSA, which has a bigger backlog than CGC. Because CGC is relatively new, you probably don't have that massive glut of people trying to get their cards graded yet. So BGS, I would recommend that anyone who's looking to get things graded, they probably should be submitting fewer cards that really have a large premium, that are worth the time to pay for a premium, like 3-day, 6-day, whatever service, a shorter service time, a quicker turnaround time to get your cards back. If you're submitting for BGS and you have bulk submissions, you'll probably be waiting a pretty decent amount of time at this point. You're probably looking at 6+ months for bulk grading to be done. If you're patient, maybe it's not that big a deal. Maybe you're okay sending these cards off and forgetting about them. That may be fine for you. For bulk cards, again, I would probably consider looking at PSA. Or if you're willing to take a gamble and you like how CGC cards are, I would send them off. I'm doing both as an experiment. I'm not pressed for time. I'm okay with a lot of these cards going off and waiting. I just want to see how CGC cards are. If they're going to be a big player in the market, this is something that I want to get in now. One, because wait times will be shorter, and two, if CGC cards are going to be as big of a deal in the future, right? I'd rather own these cards early and get these in early before people really start to catch on, and make perhaps CGC kind of the mainstay for graded cards. All in all, that's more or less all there is to say for right now. I could go on and on. I think graded cards, they're worth looking at. I would encourage anyone who is thinking about doing so, do some more research, look at the different websites. There are videos that can help you if you're looking to grade cards yourself. I do imagine that it does require a fair level of commitment, of knowledge to do so, mainly because there is a lot that goes into grading cards. You have to be patient. I would probably look at it critically. If you are looking for cards and you're looking for it in terms of an investment piece, I would go on eBay. I would probably buy some cheap cards first, just as a reference point. Just so you know, if you want to submit cards to Beckett, for example, buy some grades of Beckett cards, right? So you can see what a 9 looks like, a 9.5 looks like, an 8.5 looks like, an 8. Because realistically, these cards, it's not 9.5 or bust. There's still a lot of value in 8.5s and 9s. One, because it does help authenticate the card. BGS does not authenticate cards. They will send something back if they believe the card has been altered, if the card is inked. That's something that they have kicked back before. They won't grade an inked card. They won't provide grade on it. But it's worth looking at various grades, seeing what a 9 surface looks like. I can't really show this on a camera, but if I take this card out of the plastic sleeve I have here and I look at the card, you can actually see, okay, this is what made this card be a 9 on the surface and why this card isn't something higher than a 9. It does take some getting used to, mainly because it is so subjective. Excuse me. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. Once you see cards enough, once you see enough graded cards, there are some people that are very good at this that don't work directly for these grading companies that will be able to just kind of look at a card and be able to eyeball, oh, this card should get X grade. It's not science. I can't provide any sort of guarantee that, you can look at your card and be able to get exact grade. But once you see enough cards, you should have a pretty good idea of where cards fall in terms of grading. And that would kind of help any sort of playing you do. There's probably a minimal threshold. If you do want to get cards graded, they probably need to be at least valuable enough or at least nice enough to be worth grading. If your card is valuable but not particularly nice, may still be worth grading. If the card is particularly nice but not that valuable, it becomes kind of a tougher decision, right? If you're spending $15 per card to get graded, right? You're trying to grade, depending on how many cards, right? I believe in order to get the $15, you need a minimum of a 50 card submission, right? That's $750 on cards that you're sending off, and that's the service that you're paying. That's the amount that you're paying for a service itself. right? Like you're probably not gonna spend $15 to get like a $10 card graded. That just doesn't really make sense because you need to sell that card for at least $25 just to break even. Right, you're obviously gonna have a tougher sell trying to, if something's only worth $10, probably not terribly rare or terribly sought after. So that's the trade-off you have. There's a lot more information out there. This is just, I'm barely scratching the surface of graded cards. I would encourage people to do more research, do more digging in the future. Grading cards, because it has such a deep and rich history, it's worth looking at even some of the more esoteric things that are maybe not something that you don't necessarily care about, but just the history is very interesting, mainly because the history is really the backbone of where what we know as collecting in this hobby has really evolved to where it is today. And that's a lot of, that's in part due to, again, what these sports cards companies have done. That's really what they've pushed in terms of holos, in terms of these premium products, serial numbers on cards. One of the most valuable cards is LeBron James' rookie card. I think it was like 2003, 2004. It's called like the Exquisite Collection or something. I don't remember exactly who made it. There's actually a patch from his jersey from his rookie year on the card itself. There is a double-digit number of that card in existence. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for this card when they last sold, mainly because they don't sell very often. It's very clear from early on in his history that LeBron James is going to be a star, probably going to be one of the best in the game. So the rookie card has done very well, and it's only gotten more and more expensive as time goes on. And we're talking about a card that was printed 17 years ago, right? That's newer than Black Lotus, right? So the history is very deep. Do your research. I can go on and talk so much more about grading cards. Do your research. I can't stress this enough. Anyone who wants to look at getting their cards graded, I encourage you to ask other people, to talk about other people, to do your research. Look at eBay, look at completed auctions, look at what cards that are similar to yours, that are similar in condition, what they look like, what they grade as, how much of a premium they're getting, is it really worth grading? Ask yourself these questions, be honest. Don't be afraid to ask for opinions. I'm no expert myself. These are just my experiences dealing with graded cards. I can offer my insight for people who want to reach out to me, who do need help. I will generally point people who are looking to do this in the direction of Charlie. It does sound like I advertise for him a lot, but I do think that what they offer is a very good product as a baseline introduction into grading cards. That's something that making it accessible to the general population for people who don't have intimate knowledge of the hobby industry, for people who have not done it before. It's a good place to start. I think the service he provides is very solid. He is very open to answering questions about grading. Having dealt with him in person before, he gave me a very honest and thorough opinion on what cards should be graded and what grade they should get. Obviously, it's going to vary from person to person. Not everyone is going to grade cards simply because they'll believe it'll increase its value. There's a whole slew of people out there who grade cards because they look cool. I don't fault them. That is a big part of the hobby. That's a big part of collecting. That's why the industry has done well as it has, is because these are all very accessible for people, because people like collecting, because people have different reasons for entry into the hobby. And that's going to be a big cornerstone of this going forward. The pandemic has been a big player in why a lot of these things have exploded in price. Indirectly, they're responsible for an increased backlog at PSA, at BGS, because with so many people having more free time on their hands, more people trying to get cards graded with them, we do see a bigger backlog. I would encourage that if you're looking to have cards graded, do your research, get it done sooner rather than later. I don't anticipate that these companies are gonna slow down anytime soon, especially if we're looking at a prolonged pandemic. And as the value on collectibles, hobbies explode, more and more people will be wanting to get cards graded. The threshold for cards getting graded will probably go down. Again, as people are wanting to do bulk submissions, you reach a price point where you have a lot of people that will just be, if I submit a few extra cards, I'll get the bulk pricing. It'll go down from X dollars to X minus like 10% or whatever the price difference is. That's worth it. That encourages people to submit cards in volume. So with more people submitting more cards in volume, you're naturally going to get a bigger and bigger backlog at these various grading services. That's why I say, if this is something that you're on the fence about, do your research, go out and get your cards graded now. It's going to be a long wait regardless. Maybe it's worth it for you to pay the premium to get your cards graded. I don't really see the market slowing down. I think the market will always be there. There's always going to be a lot of demand for graded cards. And as the hobbies slowly continue to get older, as Magic gets older, as Pokemon gets older, as sports cards continue to get older, and people are starting to become more accepting of these hobbies as mainstream, as legitimate, as people have more and more money to put into their hobbies, with the nature of the pandemic, right? We've talked about this before. We've talked about this with various people, their experiences. When people aren't able to go out and spend money the way they would conventionally spend money, right? You're going to have more collectors looking to get into the collectible market and as a place to sink their money. And that's really just going to push this over the edge. I don't think it's going to slow down, right? The nature, if you look on the websites, they're all three of these companies, PSA, Beckett, CGC, they're actually all hiring. And I imagine that's the virtue of the pandemic. It's the increase in demand is they're really needing more people. But the reality situation is you can only do so much when it comes to hiring. You can't exactly say I think Charlie put it best. You can't really say I'm going to hire additional graders for the season while things are busy to go through our backlog. That's not really how card grading works. It's not really seasonal. There is a large influx right now. And it remains to be seen how long we'll continue to see it. But I do think that with as many people trying to get in now, trying to get cards graded, that doing so sooner rather than later would be in your best interest. I'll say this again. I honestly cannot stress this enough. Do your research. Know exactly what you're getting yourself into in terms of grading cards. Make sure it's something you want. Make sure that you're doing it properly. Rather, if you're going to do it yourself, don't be cutting corners. They do ask that you send your cards insured to make sure that it gets to them safely. You want to, again, do what you can to protect your cards. It's worth the time. It's worth the investment. It's worth the research to make sure that you're protecting yourself and you're doing everything correctly. Again, I can be a resource for people that have basic questions. There's plenty of information out there. This is likely a topic that I'll be coming back to in a future video when we talk about this again. Again, I'm barely scratching the surface. There's so much more that can go on in this that I think it's worth spending a lot more time to go about. Unfortunately, we're getting towards the end. I'm going to wrap this up. Graded cards, they're very cool. There's a lot to them. Do your research. Do what makes sense for you. And at the end of the day, it is a hobby for people that there are always going to be people that are investing, looking to make money on this. I don't fault them. The nature of the hobby being valuable, cards becoming valuable, is something that's very attractive to people who are simply looking to make money on this. I don't fault them, but there's still no shortage of collectors that fundamentally collecting is what they do. That's what they know. That's what they like. And that's really going to be the backbone of this going forward. As always, I'm on Twitter at Edwin13. That's where you can find me. You can send me questions, chat about things with me on there. I'm trying to be fairly responsive. You can find Vermilion on the right through our social media channels. We're on TCG Player. We are on eBay. You can find us on there for things that you may need. As always, be safe out there. I'm in Portland, so And if you've been watching the news, Portland's been dealing with a slew of wildfires. It is going outside is fairly dubious. The air quality is exceedingly poor. It's actually hazardous to go outside without a mask on, not just because of COVID, but because of how poor the air quality is. It is very, very smoky outside. Luckily, I am outside the evacuation zone, so I haven't had to be evacuated yet. We haven't had to leave yet. The air quality is just very, very poor. It's hard to see a far distance away, but that's what we've dealt with. Luckily, I haven't had too many issues here. We did have our power go out, and I know some of my friends who are a little bit south and west of here are closer to the evacuation zones. They've had to be prepared to leave at a moment's notice. So that's the nature of things. Wherever you are in the world, be safe, and we will be back tomorrow